Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the 5th episode of our 6th season of Diplomatic Immunity, looking at the geopolitical and economic fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From energy to technology to intelligence to geopolitical alignment, Russia's invasion marks a sea change in numerous areas of diplomacy and foreign policy. Today, we'll be covering the effects of the war in Ukraine on supply chains, the defense industrial base, and the private sector. We talked to Christine Micheinzi, a former senior executive at the U.S. Department of Defense, about how the global economy and defense industry is trying to deal with the knock-on effects of Putin's war.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Christine Micheinzi. She is the founder and CEO of the consultancy group MMR Defense Solutions, as well as a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Defense Industrial Initiatives Group. Dr. Micheinzi previously served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the Senior Technology Advisor for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment and the Chief Technology Officer for the Industrial Base Policy Office. We're thrilled to speak with her today, so let's listen in on the conversation. I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Micheinzi. Chris, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
So today, to pick up on our topic of sort of the unintended consequences and strategic surprises that have emanated from the war in Ukraine, one of the major things that have come out of that have been a focus on the US and our partners and allies in Europe, especially on the defense industrial base and the capabilities or lack thereof of producing things and having enough of a stockpile of weapons to face multiple challenges moving forward. And this sort of kicked off during COVID when we started to, people that don't really think of supply chains all the time started realizing that there were supply chains and things like pandemics can hinder what we get and where we get it from and how fast we get it and what's made and not made. But let's start by laying the groundwork a little bit for our listeners. And what do we mean when we say defense industrial base?
Right. So I'll just get real technical with what the Department of Defense considers defense industrial base. There is actually an instruction, of course, that defines the defense industrial base as a skill, facility, process, or technology needed to design, develop, produce, repair, or maintain products used by the Department of Defense. The department buys products and services, not capabilities, but every product or service represents a set of industrial capabilities.
Okay. And when we think of that, how does it look a little bit different from the rest of the economy? Like, we source stuff from all over the world. There might be pieces from 10 different countries that make it into the product you buy, but it's assembled in one country and then it comes to the US, or there's parts that come to the US and then it's assembled in the US. The defense industrial base, I'm assuming that the sourcing isn't quite as broad, but there's still an aspect of that. How does it look different, or does it, from the normal economy?
Right. The defense industrial base is a global industrial base. The U.S. has never had and can never have a completely domestic industrial base for defense. We just don't have enough demand in some instances to support domestic source for some of the products that we use. And there is some innovative technology that some of the other countries have, for instance, that we need to take advantage of to get the best technology for the warfighter. So there's a lot of dual use technology. So we have some instances where we use commercial technology that also has DoD application, but there is some unique defense technology both in the U.S. and in the world and our ally and partner nations that we leverage as well.
I think that's a key point to keep in mind too, because there's been a lot of discussion, especially around defense capabilities on, at least, on the Hill and in the media and in policy circles, about this idea of sort of decoupling and sort of being able to do this without sourcing stuff from China or other places to tighten up your supply chains, especially in the defense industrial area. But I think an understanding of the fact that that really can't happen, I think, is an important place to start from. So take us back a little bit to just before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Supply chains had already been thrown for a loop because of the pandemic. What did things look like in, say, January of 2022? Where was it sort of everything okay, or had there already been snags developing because of the pandemic?
Right. Yeah. So everyone thinks that COVID-19 caused all the supply chain issues that we're seeing today. But even prior to the pandemic, DoD definitely realized that supply chains were fragile. The DoD has been tracking and reporting on industrial based issues for many, many years, really outlining the means to try to mitigate those. Most notably, the DoD, specifically the Industrial Based Policy Office, where I used to be the Chief Technology Officer, publishes every year an annual industrial capabilities report to Congress. And that's available publicly. Anyone can get access to that outline the issues within the industrial base. And then it has published really some comprehensive reports, one in response to Executive Order 13806, which was titled Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing and Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency of the United States. That was in 2018 in the previous administration. And then in this administration, Executive Order 14017, titled Securing Defense Critical Supply Chains, was published in 2022. So there's been a lot of work describing the fragility of the supply chains even prior to COVID 19. Now, having said that, COVID 19 did exacerbate some of those issues, but I think really what it did was it brought those issues in the supply chain to the forefront and to the attention of the American public. I always like to say that the American people really didn't understand supply chain fragility until they couldn't get a car or until they couldn't get their car repaired, right?
Yeah, or toilet paper. Yeah.
Or toilet paper, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, there became a greater awareness of the supply chain issues. It wasn't that they didn't exist before.
Yeah, like you said, I think that went a long way to start getting these things on the radar of people. But then the war did happen, and I remember fairly quickly after it became apparent that it wasn't going to be over in a week or two or even a month or two, there was already talk about, how much can we actually send them and still be able to have stockpiles and things that we need from the United States standpoint. So at this point, we're 2 years into this almost, which is hard to fathom. But what does the situation look like today as far as supply chains, availability of munitions, and our ability to increase output to ensure that we have the ability that we need to have if, because there's a lot of other things going on besides Ukraine.
Right, exactly. First, I'd like to say, and the undersecretary always talked about this when he talks about this topic, because I was the senior advisor for the undersecretary on this particular topic. First, no one anticipated the prolonged high volume conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine. For instance, the United States alone has donated over 2 million rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition to Ukraine. There was no way that the U.S. or any of our allies could have been prepared to keep up with this level of demand. This is just unprecedented. Our industrial bases are sized to the demand signal that we give them. They don't maintain excess capacity. There's no incentive for them to do that. We don't pay them to do that. And for decades now, that demand signal has been peacetime demand. So, for example, our 155 millimeter production line was producing 14,400 rounds per month because we had a stockpile of 155 millimeter ammunition, and that's how much the services used each month. So we didn't need more capacity to produce 155 millimeter ammunition. And people need to understand that these are complex production lines that just can't be turned off or on based on the requirements of the day. Having said that, DoD does attempt to surge quickly in times of crisis, such as the Ukraine conflict and other crises that have happened in the past several years or decades to meet these requirements. But there's many constraints that prevent them from doing so quickly. Things like capacity, workforce is always an issue. We have workforce shortages even when we don't have a crisis. Obsolescence of parts, long lead time items, etc. Even when we have all those things that we need to expand capacity, it can still take months or even years to do so. And then the deliveries at that increased capacity come years afterwards due to long production lead time. So it's not a quick, flip a switch and we suddenly are able to produce many, many items. Having said that, the DoD is expanding production capacity for the munitions being supplied to Ukraine out of inventory. Prior to my retirement, I led a specialized team of munitions and industrial base experts that perform quick deep dives into the supply chains and worked with the services and industry to help accelerate the production of those munitions. We were successful. Luckily, Congress has been very generous in supporting these efforts. We were successful in getting about $2.5 billion in supplemental funding to make those industrial based investments necessary to do so. So there is progress. It just doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, I think that, well, first, just to clarify for listeners, when you say 155 millimeter round, you're talking like howitzer artillery rounds,
Correct.
which are being lobbed at ridiculous numbers, both by
Yes.
the Russians and the Ukrainians at each other in their fixed positions. It's an important point to make, I think, when you talk about the fact that it is difficult to sort of really flip a switch to try to increase the output of munitions, whether they be drones or artillery rounds or whatever's being produced by these defense companies because of a lot of the things you mentioned. So, that being said, sourcing things becomes something where you try to find sources elsewhere as well. How did that come into play as well when you think of the broader defense industrial base? How do we think about that when we think about allies and partners, and what role do they play in this, today and moving forward?
Right. Yeah. Allies and partners have been key in this endeavor. So the secretary had the United Defense Contract Group with his counterparts in the different nations, but the undersecretary stood up a group under the auspices of that with the National Armaments Director, so his equivalents in the different countries. And under that, he had the different working groups looking at the different capabilities and seeing where partners could either donate weapon systems to Ukraine or leverage different technologies or different capabilities or components to help each other be able to provide capability better. So, for instance, I led the working group on ground based long range fires. So, things like the artillery that we talked about earlier, mortars, things like that. So, looking at, which countries could donate more to Ukraine, which countries could increase production of those systems to be able to give more, which countries had components that some of the countries were lacking to be able to scale up their production capacity so that they could donate those components. Even Ukraine was trying to produce in country while they were in the midst of a war. They were still trying to produce some items in country. So they were actually asking for components as well. So it was really a concerted effort, not just by the US, but also with the partners and allies to try to come up with as much product as possible, but also supply components and products and unique capabilities. There were instances where we were putting together components from different countries into unique weapon systems. So we were looking at a launcher and a radar system from one country and a missile system from another country and putting those together into a brand new weapon system that we were deploying to Ukraine very quickly and using it to great effect. So it was really a unique situation where all the countries were coming together and trying to provide capability and sometimes unique capability as quickly as possible.
Your point makes me think of something else, and the fact that we're working with NATO on this and this unique situation in Ukraine, and it's not a war somewhere else. Whereas our major partners in this are part of an alliance with us that we have a lot of interoperability with, that we already sort of know who has what and who produces what because we've been in an alliance with them for 75 years. Is that playing a major factor in this as well?
Well, you would think that we would know exactly what each of those countries was able to produce, but we really found out that we didn't. When it comes down to the details, we really were not exactly sure about each country's capability with regards to exactly how much their capacity was, whether they were producing at full capacity currently, whether they had any excess capacity available. So we knew, for instance, that they produced 155 millimeter or 152 millimeter, which is the Russian variant of that same howitzer ammunition rounds. We knew that. but we didn't know how many they could produce and whether they could produce more or whether they were planning to scale up that production. So those kinds of details were really what we had to go out and gather so that we could paint a complete picture of where there might be opportunities to provide extra ammunition and other systems to Ukraine, and where there might be the potential to scale up quickly so that we could continue to provide once, because most of the countries, including the US, are giving weapon systems out of their inventories currently because there's just they can't produce enough quickly, so they're giving out of inventory and then using production to replenish. So it's important to understand how quickly you can replenish, because that means that's directly related to how much you can give currently. So it was really those details that were important to gather, and that's the information that we didn't have and that we were able to gain.
So you also mentioned the question that your other comment made me think of when you had mentioned that allies had gotten together and were taking different munitions and components and creating whole new systems. And we know that a lot is coming out of this war and the military side on changing war tactics, the changing, how new technologies are going to be implemented and used on the battlefield. So there's a lot of things to learn from a military standpoint on from the war in Ukraine. What lessons do you think we can take away from the first 2 years of the war moving forward from a defense industrial base perspective?
Right. So I think that there are definitely lessons to be learned here. Um, some of them are things that we already knew were things that we needed to do differently to make our industrial base more resilient. But when in times of peace, sometimes these things seem less urgent. So things that now that there is this crisis, there's the conflict in Israel, there's the potential of some kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. This has really brought all this to the forefront, and there's again more attention to it. And so, and it's not just the industrial base; it's things like how the department does acquisition, how Congress is funding, some of these activities that are going to play a big role. So, for instance, one of the things that the department has been advocating for many years is the use of multi-year procurements for critical munitions. So typically munitions are funded on a 1 year cycle because that's the way the Defense Department budget goes. And unfortunately, that doesn't provide the stability to industry to be able to make the investments they need to have a more resilient, meaning the ability to surge or the ability to withstand shocks, either surging or downturns in the industrial base, especially at the sub-tier suppliers, right? At the lower tier suppliers. So luckily, Congress has really recognized this, and in FY23 NDAA, they did give authorization, not appropriation, but at least authorization for certain weapon systems to do multi-year procurement. So that's huge, right? That gives industry the confidence to invest in capability and capacity to include some surge capacity, for instance. Advanced procuring long lead time items is another way that the industrial base can be more resilient. And that's something that we haven't had the authorization do for a long time as well. That's something that's in the FY24 NDAA. So these are helpful because if they can be on the shelf when you're ready to surge, they're there. So these are some of the things that can help, including industrial base health as a criteria when making acquisition decisions, not just cost, schedule, and performance. That's another thing that the department can do from an acquisition perspective. So there are things that can be done. It's just a matter of making it a priority. And I think that the fact that there are numerous crises happening in the world right now has sort of brought to the forefront that we need to look at these things more closely.
So let's turn a little bit to Ukraine's adversary. And we know that Russia has gone out and has gotten things like drones and some missiles from Iran. They've gotten a lot of artillery shells from North Korea. But for the most part, reports are that they still seem to be able to fire larger amounts of artillery and things on a daily, weekly basis at the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians can. So, how has Russia, from your perspective, approached this? What are they doing differently? Are they doing anything differently? How have they been able to keep sending munitions to the battlefield?
Right. So Russia, obviously has some deep coffers. They have a lot of, weapon systems. We thought that Russia was a peer adversary, and we've learned through this conflict that we don't believe there, really is on a level playing field as a peer adversary as we really once thought they were. Certainly, they do have some advanced capability, but a lot of the weapon systems and the platforms that they've been using in Ukraine are very old systems, and a lot of the inventory that they have is very old as well. So they have a lot of depth, but it's not the highest and greatest technology. The way they're conducting the conflict on the battlefield is certainly not the way the U.S. would conduct the conflict on the battlefield, and that has really hurt them. Even with the overmatch that they have, they still haven't been able to defeat Ukraine. So, that tells you something, right? And the sanctions that the U.S. and other countries have placed on them have had a detrimental effect on them. So, the number of weapons that they have really can't make up for their lack of military strategy. So, it's really up to Ukraine and its partners and allies, to include the U.S., to really remain strong and dedicated to the cause. So, because we're seeing that Russia is struggling, even though they seem to have this overmatch.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing too that you mentioned the sanctions and things. I think a lot of the higher end capability sort of things are going to be affected, but they might still be able to pump out artillery shells, for instance, for a while. But so moving back to the congressional question in domestic politics here in the U.S., there's a lot of obviously ongoing chatter about whether or not we're going to fund more money for Ukraine. Are there, short of congressional approval, are there any other sort of tools or things that the executive branch has to move forward on getting munitions and arms to Ukraine, or are we basically stuck in where we're going to need congressional approval at this point?
Yeah. So, first I want to just say that people need to understand, that the Ukraine conflict is not solely about Ukraine. It's really about letting Russia take over whatever part of the world it deems it wants to with no consequences. That includes territories of our allies and partners. If Russia defeats Ukraine, it sends a message to them and other adversaries that the United States and other allied nations will not stand in their way as they conquer innocent nations, in their quest for global powers. We really can't stand by and let that happen. Also, China is watching what is happening in Ukraine very closely. If the concerted effort of the United States and its allies and partners cannot defeat what turns out to not be a peer competitor after all, this may embolden them to push forward with their intent to reunify Taiwan with China, for instance. So people need to understand this is not just, we're giving stuff to Ukraine. If Congress is not able to come to some kind of resolution on supplying things to Ukraine, there are still things we can do. The United States has been supplying items out of inventory that still leave enough to meet national security crime. There's a very detailed analytical process to decide what has been given to Ukraine so far. Again, it's all coming out of inventory, but there is a process to decide, okay, we need to leave enough in inventory to make sure that we're prepared for a potential conflict so that we're not sacrificing national security. So this practice can continue, although there are some inventories at this point that are to the point where there is little excess remaining, so that there's not going to be as much to give, but there is still some to give. European partners are contributing as well, but they're sometimes in the same kind of situation, right? And unfortunately, they've not met some of their advertised goals, so that's unfortunate. So hopefully, they're turning that around, like you said, with this new NATO agreement. Hopefully, that's going to help step up. We really need, it's really an all hands on deck effort. The U.S. can't do this alone. It has to be European partners and allies in conjunction with the U.S. supporting this. But there are still things that can be done, but it really is going to be the most helpful to have the Congress appropriate that money so that we can have the most concerted effort that possible to make sure we keep Ukraine in this fight.
Last question, I'll just kind of get you out on this. You're in the private sector now. If you had a policymaker DoD hat back on, what maybe aren't we doing that you wish we were doing right now as far as policies go, or what do you wish we were maybe doing more of that we are sort of doing as far as the industrial complex?
So I would say, you may have seen that the department published the first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy. The Industrial Based Policy Office published that. And it's a wonderful document. It's very comprehensive. I would say that, it incorporates a lot of information that had previously been published in those reports I mentioned earlier. So, but it's really, nice to have it all in one place. The challenge becomes that the implementation of that plan and the way that the industrial base is going to become resilient and what it really needs to be for the United States to really have the strong, resilient industrial base it needs to be a deterrent, because a strong defense industrial base is a deterrent. If our adversaries understand that we have the capability and capacity to enter a conflict and win, they will be less likely to want to engage and more likely to seek a diplomatic solution. So the defense industrial base is a key part of our national security strategy. So we have to have that. And in order to have that, in my opinion, in order to implement that kind of strategy, it's going to take not just the Department of Defense. A lot of the things that are needed are out of the Department of Defense's control. So I talked earlier about Congress and the ways that Congress needs to help with stable budgeting, for instance, and no CRs and, multi-year procurements and long lead time items. But there are things that, that the Department of Commerce can do with trade and sanctions, and there's things that trade folks can do. There's things that the labor and education departments can do with regards to workforce, and things that industry can do with regards to innovation and trying to modernize their capabilities. So people have to understand, everyone has to understand that this is a critical national security priority, and everyone has to put aside sort of their personal priorities and really focus on working together to make this happen, or it's not going to happen. The Department of Defense cannot do this alone. And so that would be my wish, is that everyone understands how critical this is and makes it a priority so that it can truly happen.
All right, Chris Micheinzi, I really appreciate you joining us today. Great conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you again to Chris Micheinzi for her time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This episode was produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.